welcome to tonight's lecture on the role of the Grail in the thought of Henri Corbin. And a warm welcome and thanks for all the labor that I know goes into this to Dr. John Carey, tonight's speaker. I think most of you know him pretty well, member of our Temenos Council and the Academic Board, and a fellow of the Academy. John, again, as you probably know, is an Irish medievalist whose love of the Arthurian tradition developed very early, and to whom the subject of the Grail has long been a subject of deep and abiding interest, as much of his work declaims. I find it a particular matter of delight that this great interest of his should have led him onwards to the study of the thought of Henri Corbin and the rich tradition of Sufi insight and spirituality, so tremendously important to us in Temenos. John, I can say with no hesitation, is one of the pillars of our academy, and not only does he bring an exemplary scholarship and knowledge to the work of Temenos, but his quiet dedication in carrying the great responsibility and labor of being editor of the review is really no small thing, and I welcome the chance to thank him publicly for that dedication. Kathleen Rain, who introduced me personally to the great gift of Corbin's work, told me in a conversation talking about Corbin before she died that she believed that it was in the thought of Henri Corbin that we would most clearly find the spirit and knowledge that should continue to enrich and inform the work of Temenos. I agree most profoundly, for I do believe that there are elements in Corbin's exposition of Sufi thought that are not easily found in our Christian tradition, and the joining of the two universes of thought can, I believe, deeply enrich both. This is one of the many reasons I welcome the subject of John's lecture so warmly. So with no more ado, may I ask you to welcome Dr. John Carey.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. Thank you all for being here this evening. It's a great pleasure to be addressing the Academy. One prefatory word, I'd just like to apologize in advance for the errors which will probably be present in my pronunciation of Arabic and Persian. Henri Corbin was, as most or all of you are well aware, one of the past century's greatest interpreters of esoteric Islam. You will also be aware, however, that he was considerably more than this. The sages of whom he wrote with such learning and with such inspiring insight were not for him mere subjects for research. They were teachers from whom he, and through him, we, could learn, guides back into a kingdom to which we have lost the key. His interests, accordingly, extended to wherever the transcendent realities described by his Sufi or Shi'ite masters have been glimpsed or pursued, in the East or in the West, long ago or in more recent times. It is in these terms that we can understand Corbin's interest in the Grail, which came to occupy an increasingly prominent place in his thought in the course of the last 14 years of his life. Corbin regarded the Grail legend as representing, in the West, something comparable to the Shi'ite esotericism of Iran. As a part of European literature, it belonged to the cultural background of his French readers in a way that Islam did not, even though traditionally minded Iranians could, for their part, find that various of the Grail romances, as he put it, seem indeed to speak the same language as their own. Thus, Corbin spoke of the Holy Grail of our Western traditions, of our Grail cycle in the West, or simply of our Grail cycle. Corbin believed that the Grail legends enshrine a mystery of supreme importance. He wrote that the esoteric theme of our Grail cycle encloses, perhaps, the secret of the truly Western spiritual tradition, and spoke of the cycle where the West perhaps deposited its most profound mystical secret when men had become incapable of sustaining it. That is, the cycle of the Holy Grail. The story of the Grail was, for him, the mystical epic of the West. But what is the most profound mystical secret, the essential mystical secret, the ultimate secret, of which Corbin believed the Grail to be the repository? When a question like this is approached by someone with an academic background, and I am such a person, several further questions immediately suggest themselves. When did Corbin begin to refer to the Grail? And are there any indications that his ideas concerning it developed over time? What earlier writers on the Grail seem to have influenced him? And what was the extent of his familiarity with the Grail romances themselves? Are his ideas about the Grail legends consonant with the views of specialists in the field, and with the findings of recent researchers in particular? Have his ideas had any impact on Arthurian scholarship? These issues are not unimportant, but it is crucial to be aware that they would, from Corbin's own point of view, have been entirely secondary. He was interested in the Grail insofar as it may mediate another realm of being, not as an episode of literary history, or as the focus of erudite debate. We can apply to Corbin his own words concerning his great departed master Suhrawardi, with reference to one of the latter's mystical treatises. Corbin wrote, "It is not this question of dating which matters to us, first and last. It is not our task to reconstruct the psychology of the young sheikh. What does matter to us, because it is what mattered to him, is the entirety of the spiritual realities which he undertook to show us. It is for each person who takes him as a guide to follow their own path." There is a challenge implicit here, and in doing my best to face it, I am keenly aware of my own inadequacies. I hope that what I have to say this evening may succeed in conveying something of what Corbin believed to be important about the Grail, and may, in so doing, cast some gleams of reflected light upon the path of each of you. I expect that everyone here has some familiarity with the story of the Grail. But since there are several versions of that story, together with a great many theories concerning its origin and meaning, a brief sketch of the legend's history may be helpful. The first Grail romance was the incomplete Story of the Grail of Chrétien de Troyes, composed toward the end of the 12th century. Here it is related that the young knight Perceval, who has been offered hospitality in a mysterious castle, sees a series of strange objects being carried through the feasting hall. A golden vessel, accompanied by a dazzling blaze of light, this being the Grail itself, a bleeding spear, and a silver platter. Perceval does not venture to inquire what all of this means, and wakes next morning to find the castle empty. Later, he learns that the Grail is a holy thing which contains the wafer of the Eucharist. Had he asked concerning it, his crippled host would have been healed and his lands restored to order. Perceval vows to find the Grail again and to pose the fateful question. But Chrétien did not live to bring the story to a conclusion. The next 30 or 40 years saw the composition of a multitude of sequels, foretales, retellings, and adaptations of the story, only a few of which need concern us directly here. Thus, Chrétien's near contemporary, Robert de Boron, accounted for the Grail's sanctity by claiming that Christ had used it at the Last Supper, and that his blood had been collected in it after his death. It is in Robert's telling that the Grail is first described as a cup rather than as a serving dish, the normal meaning of the old French word Grail, and that it comes to be associated with the Passion and with Joseph of Arimathea. In the early years of the 13th century, the German poet Wolfram von Eschenbach composed a greatly expanded version of Chrétien's story, which he claimed to have corrected on the authority of a Provençal poet named Quillot, who had drawn in turn on an old manuscript discovered in Toledo, itself the work of a pagan sage named Phlegetanis, who had in turn found an account of the Grail written in the constellations. Wolfram's Parsifal, Parsifal being the German form of Percival's name, is a work of extraordinary imaginative vitality, which portrays the Grail as a magical stone brought to the earth by angels and guarded by a secret order of knights in a fortress hidden in the wilderness. The Parsifal inspired other German Grail narratives, in which the Grail is said to have been taken away at last into India and the fabulous empire of Prester John. There were also further developments in France. The introduction of the Grail, regarded as a relic of Christ's Passion, into the chivalrous world of Arthur's Round Table, served as an occasion for reflecting on the tension between the Christian ideal of ascetic sanctity and the knightly ethos of courtly love. Percival, portrayed by Chrétien and Wolfram as a lover and husband, is in other versions made to remain celibate even in marriage, or to end his days as a hermit. Eventually, in the prose romance The Quest of the Holy Grail, his place as ultimate Grail knight is taken by the virginal Galahad. In the quest, Galahad and his companions journey to the mysterious city of Saras in the vicinity of Egypt, where Galahad dies after beholding ineffable mysteries within the Grail. The Grail itself is taken up into heaven, never again to be seen by mortals, and Arthur's kingdom, of which the Grail quest had been the undoing, collapses amid catastrophe. This rapid and very selective overview is as uncontroversial as anything can be in Grail studies, largely because I have deliberately avoided the question of what source or sources lay behind the texts which have come down to us. Here, there are a myriad conflicting opinions, the mere enumeration of which would outstrip the limits assigned to this talk. One striking indication of the distinctiveness of Corbin's approach is his near indifference to this highly charged and apparently inexhaustible debate concerning origins. To be sure, Corbin's own most extended discussion of the Grail legend was inspired by two contributions to that very debate. These were, first, the arguments of Henry and René Kahane that several elements in Wolfram's Parsifal and the word Grail itself derive ultimately from the corpus of writings associated with the legendary sage Hermes Trismegistus. And second, the even more speculative and considerably obscurer contention of Sir Jahangir Koyaji that analogies in the Grail legends with aspects of Iranian epic tradition could be explained by the exposure of Celts to the Mithraic mysteries, whether in Roman Britain or in the Celtic territory of Galatia in Asia Minor. But Corbin, although his familiarity with both Hermetic thought and Iranian legend inclined him to view these theories with sympathetic interest, did not see them as having any primary bearing on the question of the Grail's true origin, for the simple reason that this origin was, for him, not situated in historical time at all. This apparent paradox reflects concerns central to his thought. Taking as a point of departure Koyaji's attempts to see the Grail cycle and Iranian accounts of the supernatural glory, or farna, as sharing a single historical source, Corbin observed that, from the standpoint of phenomenology, the proposition seems both to go too far and nevertheless to remain on this side of what is truly in question. It goes too far because this theory of material identification is extremely vulnerable. At a stroke, we risk losing the benefit obtained from the analogies which it has brought to light. And precisely in causing us to lose them, it remains on this side of the consequences of these analyses, insofar as the latter permit us to glimpse the field of a spirituality common to the idea of the farna and the idea of the Grail. To doubt this material identification does not by any means entail a refusal to see the analogies which it brings to light, but it is necessary to valorize them in the fashion that they require. To be sure, the historian who can only judge material facts shakes his head before a fact which escapes the categories of positivist science and which cannot be accounted for by going back causally from like to like. Historical comparatism, in seeking to derive one phenomenon from another, or both from a third, runs the perpetual risk of flattening, or indeed of denigrating, its materials. A thing is nothing but its purported source, or two objects of comparison are understood solely in terms of their least common denominator. How far Corbin was removed from this perspective can be seen not only in such programmatic statements as that which I have just quoted, but also in those Grail texts which held the greatest significance for him. His writings reflect knowledge, whether at first or second hand, of Chrétien, of Chrétien's continuators, Vauchier, Manissier, and Gerbert, of Robert de Boron, of the prose Lancelot, of the so-called Vulgate cycle, in particular the already mentioned Quest of the Holy Grail and its foretale, the history of the Holy Grail, of the German versions, primarily Wolfram's Parsifal and its continuations, of the Dutch Lancelot, and of the Welsh Peredur. Apart from mentioning them, however, Corbin has next to nothing to say about the earliest Grail writers, such as Chrétien and Robert. Rather, he returns again and again to the Vulgate cycle romances, especially The Quest, and to the German branch of the legend, not only to Wolfram, but also, repeatedly, to passages from the later, younger Titurel and Lohengrin. Corbin is not the only scholar to have found such late versions particularly meaningful, a proceeding which has led one Arthurian expert to complain of analysis in which, as he puts it, it is not simply a matter of ignoring the existing chronology, but of replacing it by another. And a second, to pose the rhetorical question, why is it that the primitive myth only shows up in later narratives? Such an approach is indeed misguided in any inquiry which takes chronology as its framework and which has the recovery of a primitive myth as its goal. But these were not the terms within which Corbin operated. For a clearer understanding of his stance, we can briefly consider two key Corbinian concepts: hierohistory, defined by Tom Cheetham as events in the eternal time of the soul, and the recital, or initiatory narrative. For Corbin, the mere presence in medieval France of both Arthurian tales and legends of Christ's Passion cannot explain the emergence of such an epiphany as the Grail. The two bodies of narrative, he wrote, could have coexisted materially, in libraries, for example, in the Western world, without any knight ever departing in quest of the Grail revealed at the Last Supper, had the event of their encounter not taken place. Where and how? Surawardi tells us of events which take place, that is to say, which have their place, in the imaginal realm of the Malakut. The spiritual event happens, in fact, elsewhere than in social history, literary history, the history of ideas, and so on. It is, without doubt, the sort of event which it is most difficult, not to say impossible, for certain epochs to imagine and to apprehend. The Grail legend belongs to that category, again quoting Corbin, of spiritual facts, always in the present, which break the irreversibility of time. It is not simply a conjecture which results from reconstituting the fading material traces of a vanished past. If the true source of the Grail legends is, accordingly, to be sought beyond the plane of sequence and causation, a plane which it enters, in Corbin's words again, like the light of a sanctuary, illuminating the outer darkness through a stained glass window, then it follows that it is not the oldest and most primitive accounts which are necessarily the truest, any more than the latest and most evolved. Each teller of the tale may, or may not, have glimpsed a different aspect of what exists timelessly in the Malakut, and some will surely have apprehended more than others. What we must seek to learn, in phenomenological rather than in conventionally historical terms, is what the tales reveal. Corbin used the term recital to render the Arabic word hikayat, which he characterized as connoting simultaneously the sense of narrative, account, history, and that of imitation, mimesis, as though to signify for us that the art or the style of the narrator, the historian, is basically that of mime. A hikayat is, therefore, an imitation, a mimesis, a repetition, a history, certainly, but a history that is essentially an image or symbol. This meaning cannot be anything other than the spiritual truth of that history, and this spiritual truth cannot be glimpsed without placing oneself within a perspective altogether different from the one familiar to our modern mythology of the meaning of history. A recital in this sense is accordingly, as Corbin repeatedly emphasized, neither history, recounting physical occurrences, nor an allegory, in which the narrative is only a sort of masquerade of abstract concepts. Rather, it describes an event of the soul. The implications of this are far-reaching. Corbin tells us that the mystic does not recount a story. He is that story, but it is a story which breaks visible history, since it is the passage to that which is hidden from the appearances of this world. The mystic is the object of this meta-historic story, because it is in him that it takes place, and this is why he is at the same time its agent, the actor, and active subject. Elsewhere, Corbin cited the lapidary formulation of Sheikh Ahmad Akhsai that the reciter, the deed recited, and the hero of the recital are one sole and single reality. And this takes place in every being according to the measure of each being. Meditate and meditate again. It is only through such recitals, so understood, that the doctrine becomes a real event. Corbin wrote, "The mystical recital says precisely what cannot be said or make itself known otherwise than under the form of the visionary symbols perceived by the reciter. There is a shift, a change of poetic level relative to the theoretical exposition." Corbin devoted a long essay to the process by which heroic epic becomes mystical epic, oriented toward the spiritual dimension, and further studies to the initiatory recitals in which Avicenna and Surawardi expressed their experiences of the visionary realm. Esoteric Islam has preserved a tradition of understanding such narratives. We no longer have such a tradition in the West, but Corbin believed that recitals can be identified in the Western literatures as well. As examples, he cited the apocryphal text The Shepherd of Hermas, the Romance of the Rose, the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, Wagner's Ring, and the Cycle of the Grail. All such writings he regarded as initiatic tales, to be read, quoting him again, with new eyes, those eyes which have long been shut in the philosophy and civilization of the West, and which our Oriental theosophers have kept open to the imaginal world. Among all these texts, it is, as we have already seen, the Grail cycle, which is our mystical epic in the West par excellence, and it is only when read in this light that it delivers to us the secret of its spiritual chivalry. Writing a year before his death, Corbin affirmed that, in fact, these events can only be perceived and recognized by an organ of perception different from that of empirical cognition, physical or historical. These are the events which fill the sagas of the heroes of epic, those of the Avesta and of the Shah Nama, for example, or those of our cycle of the Grail. They are, again, the events of the inner, secret history which inspires the genius of parables, the truest stories of all. I hope that these quotations give some impression of the level on which Corbin believed that it is necessary to encounter the Grail romances. But what does such an encounter bring us? What is the secret of the truly Western spiritual tradition which the Grail conceals? By its very nature, the reality of this secret could not be disclosed in any of Corbin's writings, nor could I utter it here even if I possessed it, and I most certainly do not. Let us remember that the recital represents, and for some enacts, an initiation. It is a door from here to somewhere else, a door which we are all considering from its hither side. As Corbin said of Suhrawardi, it is for each person who takes him as a guide to follow their own path, and that path must lead far beyond the lecture hall. What we can do here, however, is to look at those aspects of the Grail legend in which Corbin found the greatest significance, those things which persuaded him that that legend is indeed our mystical epic of the West. Essential to the whole of Corbin's enterprise, the great project of a life, to borrow again his own words concerning Suhrawardi, was his conviction of the indispensable importance of esotericism. Esoteric and exoteric are not alternatives, as things can be which exist on the same level. The esoteric, by connecting the manifest with its hidden source, brings divine and mortal face to face, and thereby fulfills not only the supreme human aspiration, but also God's purpose in granting being to the universe. Without this secret dimension, without initiation, the world itself would fade and fail. The place of the esoteric encounter, where the human face meets the face of God, is not the exoteric community of institutional religion. Rather, it is an initiatic circle, at the heart of which is each individual's unique service of a unique Lord. To see this discipline, this adventure of the soul, as existing in rivalry or opposition to the claims of exoteric religion is wholly to misconceive its nature. It belongs to a different plane and has no concern with aspirations to spiritual, let alone secular, authority. In this context, Corbin was profoundly struck by the fact that the Grail romances posit a hidden succession of Grail keepers who neither challenge Rome nor defer to it. In one of his first references to the Grail, he spoke of the way in which the dynasty of the guardians of the Grail, in our Western tradition, projects above the official hierarchy of the Church. Corbin's ideas on this subject were strongly influenced by A.E. Waite's book, The Hidden Church of the Holy Grail, an influence which can be clearly seen in his repeated references, when speaking of the Grail, to the way of the secret church, concealed in the secret shrine of the soul, to an ecclesia spiritualis, and to a hidden Johannine church, transcending the Church of Peter. But Corbin made Waite's vision his own, perceiving in the Grail dynasty an analogy to the doctrine that the succession of the imams, believed by Shiites to be the true heirs of the Prophet, is an esoteric lineage, apart from, because existing beyond, the politics of this world. Thus, he could write that Parsifal Prester John is henceforth for the Johannine Church, the secret church of the Grail, the equivalent of the one whom Shiite Gnosis calls the celestial pole, the hidden imam, summit of a spiritual hierarchy unknown to men. The human institution in which Corbin found the closest analogy to the mystical encounter was not priesthood, but knighthood, an initiatory order centering upon each individual's fealty to his lord, an intimate and reciprocated relationship of total dedication. To this corresponds what Corbin called spiritual chivalry, the soul's relationship to the angel of the face, the unmanifest Godhead's unique self-manifestation to each single being. In Shiite mysticism, this relationship can be expressed as devotion to the hidden imam, characterized by Corbin as the divine face for man and the human face looked upon by God. And, as Corbin noted, such devotion is in fact described in this tradition as knighthood, futuat in Arabic, javan mardi in Persian. You may remember my mentioning that Wolfram von Eschenbach described the Grail as being guarded by an order of knights. He called them Templars, alluding to a great knightly order of his own day, whose secrecy, together with its links with the East, and especially with the Temple in Jerusalem, can only have been powerfully suggestive for Corbin. Wolfram also portrayed heathen, that is, Muslim, heroes as being perfect knights, while the quest of the Holy Grail, for its part, affirms that from every land, be it Christian or heathen, where chivalry resides, knights are seen flocking to the round table. Statements which inspired Corbin to speak of ecumenical chivalry and of a universal elite. Sworn to celibacy as long as they guarded the Grail castle, Wolfram's Templars might also be summoned to go forth into the world if they were needed there. They could then marry, but must keep their identity an absolute secret, even from their wives. In this strict incognito, Corbin saw a counterpart to the mystical order of knights which surrounds the hidden imam. Elsewhere, he observed, "We can say, I believe, that on either side a single spiritual chivalry is expressed in two symbols whose outer form may perhaps differ, but which indicate and guide the same inner geste." One of Corbin's fundamental symbols was that of the Orient, conceived not as a direction in three-dimensional space, but as the perennial wellspring of light. He took this image from his master Surawardi, who called his own teaching the Oriental Theosophy, and whose followers were designated the Ishraqiyun, the Orientals, in this metaphysical rather than geographical sense. Not only was the Grail already described as having been brought to Britain out of the East by Robert de Boron, but the Vulgate cycle, culminating in the quest of the Holy Grail, linked its destiny with the mysterious city of Saros on the borders of Egypt. It is from Saros that the Grail was conveyed to Britain, and it was in the spiritual palace in Saros that Galahad gazed into it before it was withdrawn from the world forever. In Germany, the younger Titurel and Lohengrin speak of the Grail being taken yet further. Its final resting place is in India, the utmost east in the eyes of medieval Europe. In this east, Corbin recognized Suhrawardi's Orient. The spiritual palace in Saros is built, he said, in the invisible Orient, the Orient which is the soul, and the India of the Grail is that which Pseudo-Abdius situated at the edge of the world. It is an Orient which, to use one of Corbin's favorite phrases, cannot be situated on our maps, an interworld that is self-sufficient, on the border between the Malakut and our world, at the same time quite close and very distant. Saras, he said, is a sister city of Horkalia, one of the cities of Suhrawardi's imaginal land of nowhere. The quest of the Grail Knights leads to the same goal as that of the Ishraqiyun. As Corbin said, as Galahad shows us the direction of Saras, Suhrawardi's recital shows us the direction of the mountain of Gaf, the mountain which borders the world in Islamic symbolism. Nothing less and nothing other. In the romances, the Grail's principal characteristic is its hiddenness. This is, of course, the basis of the quest. The Grail castle lies no one knows where, and can only be found by those destined or chosen, or by those who have made themselves worthy. Even when one is in its presence, it is invisible to unbaptized or sinful eyes. And at the end, its withdrawal into the Orient or into heaven has removed it yet further from mortal gaze. As Corbin commented, whether one says that Parsifal conveys the Holy Grail into the Orient, or that it is conveyed by Galahad to Saras, whence it is taken up into heaven, the event signified is the same, for Orient and Saras are, like Horkalia, places of the eighth climate, invisible to the senses of those who have not been baptized in the cup. This transfer is the transfiguration of the mystic, anticipating his personal eschatology. Here, too, Corbin found an analogy to the hidden imam of Shi'ism, whose occultation has taken him into a realm beyond the physical senses, although he may from time to time appear, unanticipated and usually unrecognized, to one or another of his devotees. For Corbin, indeed, the questions, where is the imam and where is the Grail, are only a single question, framed in varying terms. The imamate, he said, has been lifted from this world, just as, in our Western traditions, were the Grail and its guardian. That these two supreme symbols, Grail and Imam, abide in concealment is essential to their nature, a nature belonging to that level of being whose key, Corbin insisted, is esotericism. He said, "This passage to the reality of the Malakut can be envisaged in many ways, as the celestial hand which, in Saras, as it withdraws the Grail, renders it invisible to men, as the taking back of the Grail into the Orient. It is always the exodus out of a world subject to the laws of the exterior senses and to the physical, an exodus achieved through the fourth dimension. Thus, when Wolfram states that the Grail remains hidden to all ages, Corbin comments, "We know what he means. It is hidden to all eyes of the flesh. The epic of the Grail ends in occultation." Together with the analogy between the Grail and the hidden Imam, Corbin followed Koyaji in affirming the Grail's identity with the farna, the glory which Iranian tradition portrays as being bestowed on those rulers or champions who enjoy divine favor. This was one of the ancient mythologisms which Suhrawardi incorporated in his Oriental Theosophy. Corbin summarized the parallels as follows. There is, on both sides, the idea of a mysterious virtue or potency of which a marvelous object, talisman, or theurgy is the form or manifestation, which is surrounded by an aura of sacrality, like the most holy of relics. This marvelous object, whether it be a form of the farna or the Grail, dispenses the food of immortality and the illumination of understanding. He who holds the plenitude of the farna possesses, together with gifts corresponding to the hieratic perfections, the victorious force of the night. The Havarna passes in succession from one hero to the next, without there being any need for the intervention of a visible agent. Like the Grail, borne to earth by the angels and entrusted to knights who are the most pure of men, the Havarna has its origin among the potencies of light. The Grail, like the Havarna, can take various forms, but is associated above all with dazzling radiance. While Corbin noted Koyaji's discussion of these similarities with approval, his own understanding of their significance was, as we've seen, very different from that of the earlier writer. Even if Koyaji were correct in discerning some kind of historical connection between the two, a hypothesis regarding which I find myself considerably more skeptical even than Corbin, this would be of only secondary importance. It is in the realm of the Malakut, above the flow of mortal time, that the unity of Grail and Farna is a matter not of antiquarian conjecture, but of spiritual reality. The same applies, a fortiori, to one of the forms taken by the Farna, that of a vessel, which, having belonged originally to the primordial sovereign Jamshid, became a treasure of the fabulous dynasty of the Kayanids, and at last of the greatest among them, Kai Khosrow. It was called the Jam-e-Jam, the cup of Jamshid, but also because it had the miraculous property that whoever looked into it could see the entire cosmos, the Jam Giti Nema, the cup which mirrors the universe. Corbin always refers to this vessel as a Grail. It figures in Firdausi's Shahnameh and was used as a symbol by various Iranian mystics. One of these latter was Suhrawardi, who included a recital concerning the Grail of Jamshid in his collection of parables, The Language of the Ants. It is apposite to cite this text in its entirety here, inasmuch as Suhrawardi's Grail was, for Corbin, a manifestation of the same reality as the Grail of medieval Europe. It runs as follows. Kai Khosrow possessed the Grail, mirror of the universe. Everything which could be the subject of his desire, he contemplated it in this Grail. There he beheld the totality of beings. There he was informed concerning the invisible worlds. This Grail was enclosed in a covering of leather, the form of which had been made like a tower and which had 10 joints. When Kai Khosrow wished to contemplate some mystery of the invisible, he gave this covering a turn to unfasten it. When he had untied all the bindings, the Grail was no longer visible. But when all the bindings were tied anew in the workshop, the Grail appeared. At the moment of the vernal equinox, Kai Khosrow held the Grail exposed to face the sun, and the luminary's radiance came to strike the Grail. And behold, all the lines and imprints of the world were manifested there. There follow 3 citations from the Quran, and then a brief verse. When I heard from my master the recital of the Grail of Jamshid, I was myself the Grail of Jamshid, mirror of the universe. May my own Grail, mirror of the universe, be uncovered. This buried Grail is a burning flame on which our death is nourished. This remarkable text, which Corbin described as Suhrawardi's attempt to say the unsayable, the accomplished fact of the return to the Orient, for which the whole of his Oriental theosophy prepares us. It described for him also the essence of the Grail cycle in the West. This can be the case because both are, again, accounts of a hidden reality. As Corbin put it, the event which he attempts to say must be grasped on the level where it is literally true. Now, it is not in our world that it is literally true, but between heaven and earth, between the greater Orient and the earthly Orient. Neither Kai Khosrow, nor Parsifal, nor Galahad has left traces in archival documents. Horkalia and the spiritual palace of Saras remain beyond the reach of archaeological excavations. And for all that, the personages are not less real than those of history. The places of their deeds are not less real than the soil dug up by the archaeologist's pick. Corbin goes on to compare Kai Khosrow's vision of all things in his Grail with the account in The Quest of the Holy Grail of how it was given to Galahad in the spiritual palace of Saras to contemplate in the Grail the supreme divine mysteries. The resemblance between the two descriptions is indeed a striking one. Here are the words of the quest. He began to tremble very violently as soon as the mortal flesh began to gaze upon the spiritual things. Then Galahad held his hands up to heaven and said, Lord, I worship you and give thanks that you have fulfilled my desire. For now I see quite openly that which tongue could not describe nor heart conceive. Here I see the origin of valiant deeds and the cause of prowess. Here I see the marvels which exceed all other marvels. And since, fair sweet Lord, you have thus fulfilled my desire by permitting me to see that which I have always desired, I pray now that you will grant me, at this point, when I am in this great joy, to pass from this earthly life to the heavenly one. Galahad's prayer is granted almost immediately, and he dies in ecstasy. When Kai Khosrow holds his Grail up to the sun of the vernal equinox, this seems to be a clear counterpart of the return of the Grail to the Orient in the Western romances. But one of the most curious details in Suhrawardi's recital is the covering of leather with its 10 joints, which must be unfastened in order to gaze into the Grail. Corbin was clearly correct in understanding this as the physical body, with its 5 exterior and 5 interior senses. But what are we to make of the fact that the Grail is kept within the leather covering? Only one interpretation seems possible, and it is given by Suhrawardi's older contemporary, Ruzbihan Bakli Shirazi. This Grail which shows the universe, it is myself. Suhrawardi too, as we have seen, says that I was myself the Grail of Jamshid, mirror of the universe. For Corbin, the same was true of the Grail of the West. He could see, he said, the quest to encounter this celestial self, ce moi céleste, as one of the hidden meanings of our epic of the Holy Grail. And he could speak of the return of beings to their true being, which is the same Grail. Is this, then, the secret of the Grail after all? There is a sense in which I could say, yes. But even in doing so, I feel the words dead on my tongue. For words is all they are, the verbal enunciation of a piece of doctrine. Tawil, the Shi'ite hermeneutic espoused by Corbin, connects symbols not with mental concepts, but with the spiritual realm which is their origin. In his own words, let there be no mistake. It is not a question of merely deriving the imaginal event or the living vision from certain abstract theoretical data. That would be to turn the back on the Orient. The event of the soul is itself first of all, the tawil which, by leading the theoretical data back to the Orient, renders them true. And there, preeminently, is the phenomenon of the hikayat, of the recital, which is at the same time history and imitation. History, because it is the imitation of a higher world, and an imitation which is its image. Here, too, the noetic function of the image and imaginative perception will appear as decisive. At the same time, the reciter, the historian, can no longer be regarded as irresponsible, isolated from the facts of the recital. For their part, the hearer or reader only realize its meaning on condition that this tawil, this hermeneutic, is accomplished in themselves. To find the celestial self, it is necessary to transform the quotidian self, to transform it so utterly that it may be said to be destroyed. This is the application of the first of the passages from the Quran, which, as I've mentioned, Suhrawardi attached to his Grail recital. He translated it as follows: "When the earth is spread out flat, when it rejects that which is in it and remains empty, when it turns its ear to its Lord and becomes worthy of him, behold, you will meet him." Sheikh Ahmad Akhsai was evidently referring to this image of the flattened earth when he warned that the mystical recital does not take on reality until the mountain of one's own egoism has been abolished. This has always been the path of the mystic, the most difficult thing in the world, and surely impossible if we did not already belong with our truest being to that other realm which calls out to us. Corbin stated, "It is necessary that the summons come from the Imam, just as it is the Grail which summons its chosen. Otherwise, no one can traverse the way." The task is beyond our mortal abilities, but it is what we have been brought into being to accomplish. At all times and in all places, the first step on the way awaits our tread. A few months before his own departure, Corbin wrote that the world in which the Grail is occulted is still visible to the eyes of fire, and that is why there will always be secret Knights Templar who pursue the quest for the Grail. Thanks very much.
Your description of the Malakut, the intermediate world, do you think that we have anything quite like it in the Christian tradition? Because certainly the way that Corbin describes it, this, what I think he refers to as a concrete spiritual universe, entered only by the imagination. Do we have such a concept in Christianity?
Well, this is something which Corbin himself repeatedly searched for with great learning and with great determination. And he did find analogies to it, which he believed reflected perceptions of the same realm of being. And I think that it's in the mystical tradition primarily associated with the figure of Dionysius the Areopagite that one finds that most repeatedly explored, or at least touched upon. People think of Dionysius primarily as a negative mystic, but in just the same way that Islamic esotericism has, on the one side, a completely ineffable and unimaginable deity, but on the other, an angelic realm which mediates between that deity and ourselves. Dionysius wrote of the angels, and wrote of angels in a tremendously sensitive and poetic and many-leveled way. And a passage which has often been quoted from a sort of indirect successor of Dionysius, the abbot of Saint-Denis, in whose monastery the Latin translation of Dionysius's writings had been made, Sujet of Saint-Denis, at one point speaks of how contemplating the beauty of precious stones, so on the material plane there's an aesthetic trigger. He feels himself caught up into a realm which is neither that of the spirit nor that of matter, but something in between. And people have often, I think, looked at that as one of the indications of a way in which a Christian notion of a concrete realm of vision might have developed. But I'm not aware that it's ever been unfolded systematically in the way in which Suhrawardi and his successors, for instance.
It just seems to me to be such an incredibly important sort of link, really, between the material plane and it's always struck me that it just isn't quite there in the Christian tradition, which is why I was so excited to find it in Ibn Arabi. But anyway, thank you.
There seems to be a reflexive propensity in humanity to materialize every spiritual mystery that's given and gifted to us. You ended your talk by talking about the spiritual Knights Templars. If you take the historical situation where Knights Templars were there initially to protect pilgrims to Jerusalem, is that not itself a materialization of a spiritual mystery? In a sense, we're all pilgrims. The Knights Templar is the embodiment of chivalry. It's something we act out or should act out in our lives. So that chivalrous aspect of our embodiment will guide the pilgrim, perhaps the mind, to the Temple of Solomon. So it's a spiritual story, but sadly it's materialized and becomes temporal history eventually, and the true spiritual meaning is lost.
No, that's very, very truly and very aptly observed. And I think that the Grail legend as well affords us a multitude of opportunities for reflecting on it. On the one hand, one of the things which makes the Grail such a numinous entity in legend is that it's it is identified as one of the supreme Christian relics, and yet it doesn't seem to be material in any conventional way. And the Church never knew quite how to come to grips, in fact, with the idea of the Grail or with the Grail legends. The Grail is something clearly analogous to, but also completely separate from the whole cult of relics as it's existed in Christianity since almost the time of its inception. And I think that is something which Corbin himself, with his ideas about idolatry and his perception of the importance of concrete perceptions which are not anchored in material specificity, he must have recognized this as being one of the things which made the Grail of central importance in the West. But another thing, of course, along these lines is the fact that, like the Templars, the Grail has been, and will surely indefinitely continue to be, the object of innumerable attempts to historicize it, materialize it, concretize it, and anchor it, for the most part nowadays, in rather high-flown and far-fetched conspiracy theories, the essence of which, I think, or or rather I should say, the principal failing of which is not their implausibility, although they certainly seem to me to be implausible, but their fundamental failure to recognize what the Grail actually is. Their sense that if the Grail is important, then it must be some political secret that the Vatican has locked up, or it must be a cup in this museum, or a vessel kept in this country house somewhere. And this again is idolatry. This again is antithetical to the essence of these legends and the spirituality which lies behind them.
Thank you, John. I've been wrestling with this with my Jones recital, and I've since been watching my local priest, which is an Anglican priest, at Mass, at the Eucharist. And Jones has this obsession with the fact that every Eucharist is an enactment, a recital, as you say, of the supreme mystery of the sacrifice of God for his people. Our priest reads the text and does a few gestures, and it happens every day, of course, in the church, whether he's just by himself or... And you don't get this feeling, which Jones seems to watch for. He actually says he watches the mystery being enacted every time he attends as a devout Catholic. And I get the sense that if you do this recital properly, and the priest does the recital properly, then that host and that chalice become the whole cosmos, and he is identified with it, and then the people share in that revelation. But how can that be done day in, day out, when everything's become a routine and just a sort of form? Is there an indication that this should be possible, that the true knight reciting the mystery can share it with everybody in this ritual, which is said to be so important and yet seems to be so matter of fact and routine?
Well, what I think you're speaking of in essence here is the whole issue of the relationship between the esoteric and the exoteric, and the practical impossibility which is reflected in the traditions of the Church all the way back to Christ's own words as they appear in the Gospels, for everybody to enter the kingdom of heaven. That the rituals are performed and that they're available to everyone is important, but the experience of what the rituals, of what is being enacted, will inevitably be different for different people. And one finds this wonderfully reflected in the Grail romances themselves, where in the quest of the Holy Grail, for instance, which really marks the late apex of the old French Grail romances, there's a whole sort of spectrum of psychological portraits of different knights, not just Galahad and Gawain and Bors, but Galahad and Percival and Bors, but Gawain and Lancelot and various others as well. And some of them see the Grail, and come into its presence. Galahad is able to gaze into the Grail. Lancelot, after long penance, is able to look upon it from afar. Others never get close to it. They go to Mass every morning, but because the rest of their lives is something which they plan to get around to doing something about presently, they it's really wonderfully delicately and effectively conveyed, this way that most of us are most of the time. They go around in circles killing each other like knights, but they never get anywhere close to the Grail.
But in the supreme performance of a piece of music, you get the feeling that a whole audience listening to Bruckner or a supreme piece of music, when you sense the conductor has achieved something which stills the whole audience. It sounds as if it should be much more possible in one way than it is.
Yeah.
One aspect of that occurred to me was that as far as the exoteric rite is concerned, it in a sense doesn't matter how much the priest is involved in an inward sense with what he's doing. As long as he performs what he's supposed to do correctly, it's the witness, whether that be the inner witness of the priest or a witness within the congregation, is what that witness perceives in what's going on. I can see an analogy with the Islamic prayers, the 5 daily prayers, where the imam, in this sense, not the, in the as there's a different meaning to him. There are different levels. The imam is like the man who leads the prayer in this sense. It doesn't matter what sort of spiritual state he's in, whether he's a good man or a bad man. He just has to be in a state of ritual ablution and perform the prayer correctly. And all those in the congregation, their prayers are accepted by God as valid, and each gets what he gets personally from it. And I think that might bear some light on your first question.
Yes, thank you for that. And I think it's important to emphasize in any talk which focuses on the esoteric approach in the way that this talk is done, and which discusses somebody for whom esotericism was as supremely important as it certainly was for Corbin, that neither Corbin nor any of the sages whom he studied and tried to expound denigrated the exoteric. They're two completely different things. They exist on different planes, and both have an essential part in humanity's relationship with the divine.
We must, I'm afraid, bring our evening to an end. John, thank you very much indeed. I sort of feel it is a story that we should be visiting and revisiting and revisiting again and again, because it does seem to contain all the elements of the quest. And thank you so much for doing it so beautifully.
Thank you. Thank you very much.